In 1962, the Pentagon presented President John F. Kennedy with a plan to stage terrorist attacks on American soil, to hijack planes, to sink ships, to murder American citizens, and then blame it on Cuba to justify an invasion. This wasn't some rogue agent's fantasy. This was an official proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking military officers in America. They put it in writing, they signed it, and they expected the president to approve it. The plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it's one of the most disturbing declassified documents in American history because it proves that the U.S. government was willing to kill its own citizens to manufacture a war. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate, and today we're exposing Operation Northwoods. Because once you understand what the Pentagon was willing to do in 1962, you'll never look at government claims about terrorism the same way again. Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to appear on the right top-level podcasts. You can grab our free brand authority analysis over at commandyourbrand.com/analysis. If you're brand new to this channel, like this video, leave us a comment, and smash the subscribe button if you want to learn more of history's mysteries. To understand Operation Northwoods, we need to go back to 1959. Fidel Castro had just overthrown the U.S.-backed dictator Batista and taken control of Cuba. At first, the U.S. wasn't sure what to make of Castro, but when he started nationalizing American businesses and cozying up to the Soviet Union, Washington panicked. Cuba is 90 miles from Florida. Having a Soviet-aligned communist government that close to American soil was a bit unacceptable to the national security establishment. The CIA wanted Castro gone. In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, a covert operation using Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. It was a complete disaster. The invasion failed, and Castro remained in power. President Kennedy refused to send in U.S. military forces to save the operation. Kennedy was furious with the CIA for misleading him about the operation's chances of success. He fired CIA Director Allen Dulles, yes, the same Allen Dulles who ran the MK-Ultra and Operation Mockingbird. Kennedy vowed to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. But the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs of Staff weren't giving up on Cuba. They believed Castro was a threat that had to be eliminated. And Kennedy wouldn't authorize a direct military invasion. They'd find a way to force his hand. Enter General Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Lemnitzer was a hardline Cold Warrior who believed the Soviet threat justified almost any action. And in early 1962, he tasked his staff with developing a plan to create a pretext for invading Cuba. What they came up with was Operation Northwoods, a series of false flag attacks designed to turn American public opinion against Cuba and justify military intervention. And the details of what they proposed are absolutely chilling. March 13th, 1962, General Lemnitzer presented a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, titled Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. This document, which remained classified for 35 years, outlined a series of false flag operations to be blamed on Castro's government. So let me read you some of what they proposed. And remember, this is an official Pentagon document signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Quote, "We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The terror campaign could be pointed at Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. They were proposing to murder Cuban refugees and blame it on Castro, real people, real deaths, to manufacture outrage. But it gets worse. Quote, "We could blow up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. Casualty lists would cause a helpful wave of national indignation." They're talking about killing American servicemen as a public relations strategy. Here's another one. An aircraft at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. At a designated time, the duplicate would be substituted for the actual civil aircraft and would be loaded with selected passengers, all boarded under carefully prepared aliases. The actual registered aircraft would be converted to a drone. The drone aircraft would continue on the flight plan. The aircraft would be transmitting on the international distress frequency a Mayday message stating it was under attack by Cuban MiG aircraft. The transmission would be interrupted by the destruction of the aircraft, which would be triggered by radio signal. They were proposing to fake a commercial airline hijacking, blow up a drone aircraft, and blame Cuba for shooting down a plane full of American passengers. And to make it convincing, they'd create fake passenger identities and fake casualty lists. But wait, there's more. They proposed staging mock attacks on Guantanamo Bay with friendly Cubans dressed as Castro's forces, blowing up an unmanned ship near Cuban waters and claiming it was attacked conducting terror campaigns in Washington, D.C. and Miami, planting evidence of Cuban involvement in other countries' problems, creating fake documents proving Cuban aggression. This wasn't a brainstorming session. This wasn't some low-level analyst throwing out wild ideas. This was a formal proposal from the highest-ranking military officers in the United States, presented to the Secretary of Defense for approval. They put it in writing. They signed their names to it, and they expected it to be implemented. On March 13th, 1962, General Lemetzer presented Operation Northwoods to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara's reaction isn't fully documented, but we know he didn't immediately reject it. Instead, he took it to President Kennedy. Kennedy's response was unequivocal. Absolutely not. He rejected Operation Northwoods outright. He was reportedly appalled by the Joint Chiefs would even propose such a plan. Here's where it gets a bit interesting. Just a few months later, in September 1962, Kennedy refused to reappoint Lyman Lemetzer as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Instead, Kennedy essentially exiled him, making him Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe, getting him out of Washington. Operation Northwoods was filed away, classified top secret. The plan was never implemented. The false flag attacks, well, they never happened. And for 35 years, the American public had no idea their own military proposed killing them to start a war. But here's the timeline you need to understand. Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods in March 1962. In October 1962, just 7 months later, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Kennedy negotiated a peaceful resolution, agreeing to remove the U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for Soviet missiles leaving Cuba. Pentagon and the CIA hardliners were furious. They believed Kennedy had been weak on Cuba, first at the Bay of Pigs, then by rejecting Northwoods, and finally by negotiating instead of invading during the missile crisis. 13 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And guess who President Lyndon Johnson appointed to the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination? Well, Allen Dulles, the CIA director Kennedy had fired after the Bay of Pigs. Now, I'm not saying that Operation Northwoods proves anything about the JFK assassination, but it does prove that the national security establishment was willing to kill Americans to get what they wanted. And Kennedy stood in their way multiple times. Operation Northwoods remained classified for 35 years. The Joint Chiefs who signed it retired or died. The Cold War ended. Cuba stopped being seen as an existential threat, and the document sat in classified archives, unknown to the public. But in 1992, Congress passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act, requiring the declassification of documents related to Kennedy's death. The goal was to finally give the public access to information about the assassination. As part of this process, the Assassination Records Review Board began declassifying thousands of documents from the early 1960s, anything that might provide context for Kennedy's presidency and his death. And in 1997, they declassified Operation Northwoods. For the first time, the American public could read the actual Pentagon proposal to stage terrorist attacks on American soil. 2001, investigative journalist James Bamford featured Operation Northwoods prominently in his book, Book of Secrets, bringing it to the mainstream attention. Suddenly, people were reading the actual words of the Joint Chiefs proposing to murder Americans. The reaction was shock and disbelief. Many people initially thought it had to be fake, a conspiracy theory, a hoax, but it wasn't. The document was real and was authenticated by the National Archives, signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So what about the Pentagon's response? Well, essentially that was a different era. That would never happen today, and it was rejected anyway, so no harm was done. No harm was done? The fact that it was proposed at all is harm. The highest-ranking military officers in America put their names on a document proposing to kill American citizens. The fact that one man, President Kennedy, stopped it doesn't erase what they were willing to do. Now, here's where Operation Northwoods becomes relevant to today. When the declassified documents became widely known in the early 2000s, it fundamentally changed how Americans viewed their government's claims about terrorism. Because Operation Northwoods wasn't an isolated incident. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident was used to justify the Vietnam War. For decades, the official story was that North Vietnamese boats attacked U.S. destroyers unprovoked. But declassified documents later revealed that the second attack never actually happened. It was exaggerated to justify escalation. In 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq based on claims of weapons of mass destruction. But no WMDs were ever found. The intelligence was faulty or it was deliberately manipulated to justify a war that killed hundreds of thousands. So when the government declassifies a document proving the Pentagon was willing to stage false flag attacks in 1962, it raises an obvious question. Did they ever actually do it? And if they proposed it once, how many other times did they propose it that we didn't know about at all? Remember, Operation Northwoods was only declassified because of the JFK Assassination Records Act. If Congress hadn't mandated that specific declassification process, we might have never known about it. So what other Northwoods-style plans are sitting in classified files right now? Pentagon claims they would never do anything like this today, but that's what they would have said in 1962 if you would have asked them. National security operations are classified for decades. We only learn what they were willing to do a generation later. And consider this. Operation Northwoods required elaborate staging, fake passengers, drone aircraft, and coordinated attacks. Today, with deepfake technology, digital manipulation, and sophisticated cyber capabilities, staging a false flag attack would be exponentially easier. Every time the government asks for authorization to go to war, every time they claim an attack justifies military action, Operation Northwoods should be in the back of your mind, because we have documented proof that they've been willing to lie, to stage attacks, to kill their own citizens, to get the war they want. Operation Northwoods didn't happen, but the fact that it was proposed and approved by the Joint Chiefs and only stopped by one man's refusal tells you everything you need to know about what the national security establishment is capable of. So what do you do with this information? How do you process the fact that your own government proposed killing you to start a war? Well, first, you need to understand the pattern. Operation Northwoods, the Gulf of Tonkin, Iraqi WMDs, and the Naira testimony before the Gulf War that turned out to be fabricated. Well, there's a documented pattern of manufacturing or exaggerating threats to justify military action. Second, be skeptical of immediate calls for war. When a terrorist attack or an international incident happens and the government immediately knows who did it and demands military action, ask questions. Remember, Operation Northwoods included plans to plant evidence and create false narratives. Third is to support declassification and transparency. We only know about Operation Northwoods because Congress mandated declassification. Demand that your representatives support Freedom of Information Act requests and declassification of historical documents. Sunlight's the best disinfectant. Fourth, support independent investigative journalism. James Bamford exposed Operation Northwoods to the mainstream, and Seymour Hersh exposed the Gulf of Tonkin lies. We need journalists willing to challenge official narratives and dig into declassified documents. The fifth thing is to learn your history. The only reason that Operation Northwoods is so important is that it provides documented proof of what the government is capable of. When someone dismisses concerns about false flags as a conspiracy theory, well, you can point to an actual declassified Pentagon document proposing exactly that. The Joint Chiefs who signed Operation Northwoods, well, they counted on it remaining secret forever. They never imagined that 35 years later, Americans would be reading their proposal to murder civilians. Don't let them keep secrets. Don't let them memory hole history. Because the moment we forget what they're capable of is the moment they're going to try it again. Operation Northwoods wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was a documented conspiracy, a real plan, signed by real generals to kill real Americans and blame it on Cuba to start a war. The only reason it didn't happen is because one man, President Kennedy, said no. Think about what that means. If Kennedy had been more hawkish, if he'd been more willing to trust his military advisors, well, Operation Northwoods could have happened. Americans could have died in staged terrorist attacks, and we would have gone to war with Cuba based on a lie. And here's the most disturbing part. We only know about this because of a specific declassification law passed 30 years after Kennedy's death. How many other Operation Northwoods style plans were proposed and rejected that we'll never know about? How many were proposed and approved? The next time your government tells you that military action is necessary because of an attack or just a threat, remember Operation Northwoods. Remember that the Pentagon was willing to stage terrorist attacks to get the war they wanted. Remember that they put in writing and signed their names to it. Question the narrative, demand evidence, and support transparency. Because the national security establishment has proven with their own declassified documents that they're willing to lie, manipulate, and kill to achieve their objectives. If this opened your eyes to what your government proposed to do to you, well, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're exposing more declassified operations that prove the conspiracies you may have heard were actually real. So drop a comment and tell me, what do you think about false flag operations? Have they actually been carried out, or did Operation Northwoods teach them to never put it in writing again? And if you want to see how deep this goes, check out my video on MKUltra, where the CIA experimented on American citizens for 20 years. Or watch my breakdown of the JFK assassination with Roger Stone. Because Kennedy rejected Operation Northwoods in March 1962, and he was dead by November 1963. Coincidence? Well, maybe, maybe not. They signed their names to a plan to murder Americans. The document is real, the conspiracy is proven, and they're counting on you to forget. I'm Jeremy Ryan Slate. Question everything, trust nothing, and I'll see you on the next investigation.